great wave of immigration. Halifax and Dartmouth became models of prosperity in northeastern America. But even in this society of fast-changing morals, strict Victorian values still won out over the new liberal attitudes of the day. On the ferries, a form of segregation typical of the era reigned.
When some of the boats began building the cabins on each side of the boat, and of course one side was strictly for women who could come with a male escort, and the other side was strictly for men. Men, as I say, could travel if they were traveling with their wife or their girlfriend, could come on the ladies' side. Ladies never ever went on the men's side.
But with ferry regulations favoring good English manners, also came aspects of social injustice. At the time, the black population of Dartmouth lived under a policy of segregation. Descendants of American slaves, these Nova Scotians, despite their contribution to the building of the country, were the objects of discriminatory rules on the ferries.
In the early boats in the last century, a lot of people going to markets in Halifax from Dartmouth, a lot of the native population and black people, and at that time there was a segregation. The black people weren't allowed in the ladies' cabins, or the black ladies weren't. They had to go in the men's side, and they weren't allowed up in the upper decks.
Ferries played a prominent role in many key events throughout Canada's history.
During the war, the First World War, 1914, there was a lot of harbor traffic with warships going in and out of the harbor, along with some of the convoys. And of course, this made it very risky for the boats because they had to sort of dart in and out of the boats. And a lot of times in fog or bad weather, there were often collisions.
On the morning of December 6, 1917, a collision between two vessels, one a fully loaded munitions ship, caused a spectacular explosion in Halifax, destroying a quarter of the city and changing its face forever. The ferries emerged unscathed from the blast, allowing them to play a heroic role in the emergency operations that followed.
The ships kept running during the day and night, and they acted kind of as an ambulance service, taking the injured from Dartmouth across to hospitals.
The ferries acted as a lifeline, linking Halifax and Dartmouth. Countless lives were saved, and the generosity of the ferry captains helped establish the climate of calm and trust. Oddly enough, during the Second World War, ferries played quite the opposite role. It was by halting ferry service that the captains prevented disaster from spreading. The story unfolds in May 1945, shortly after the announcement of armistice. Freshly demobilized sailors and soldiers swarmed through the city of Halifax, intent on celebrating war's end. Many jubilant civilians joined them. But gradually, the atmosphere turned from joy and enthusiasm to dangerous exuberance.
When the war ended on May the 7th, 1945, that was the final day of the war. The next day, VE Day, was May the 8th. And so what had happened is that they gave leave to a lot of the military people in Halifax, mostly the Navy, but some Army and Air Force people. And of course, what the civilian population did was closed everything down. The restaurants were closed, the liquor stores and so on. And so there were no places for the sailors to drink. So they rioted. They broke into the liquor stores and the breweries in Halifax and took the liquor. Within a few hours, many of them were intoxicated. When they ran out of drinks in Halifax, then they came on the ferry boat to Dartmouth, and the liquor store then was just up here on the waterfront, so it was just a short distance to go up to to break into that and to cart the liquor away, and then they were still drunk, so then they came back down along the main street in Portland and they broke that up. But the one or two boatloads did get over, but before too many got on, the police chief decided that they would halt the ferry system, and so that kept a lot of the if they hadn't have done that, the rioting probably would have been a great deal worse than what it was. But a lot of them did get over, but they had to stop the boats.
That was one of only a few occasions when service on the Halifax-Dartmouth Ferry was interrupted. Until that historic day, only ice in the previous century and a few hurricanes had managed to halt the crossings. The Halifax-Dartmouth Ferry is renowned for the regularity of its service. The reign of ferries lasted nearly 400 years before competition from bridges rendered them less essential. It was only after the mid-19th century that the banks of Canada's great waterways were permanently linked. The first bridge to span the St. Lawrence between downtown Montreal and the South Shore was the Victoria Bridge, opened in 1860. The Quebec Bridge was erected 60 years later, and in the 1950s, the Halifax-Dartmouth and Vancouver bridges were opened. All the great bridges of Canada were born of a technological boom sparked by the Industrial Revolution. The arrival of cars and planes in the early 20th century relegated many of Canada's ferries to the history books. Times have changed, but not all ferries are doomed to disappear. Some of Canada's ferries are just as important today as they were in the country's early days. Those that connect islands to the mainland, in the St. Lawrence and on the Pacific Ocean, are continuing the proud tradition of Canadian ferries.